LSD was never meant to exist, yet it became the molecule that split human consciousness open. Born from a cursed medieval fungus that once ignited madness across Europe and rediscovered centuries later in a Swiss laboratory, a single accidental exposure hurled a chemist into a storm of living color and shattered the boundary between mind and world. What followed reshaped the modern era. The molecule slipped from sterile glassware into Cold War interrogation rooms, into the hands of visionaries and rebels, into the bloodstream of a generation searching for truth. Its chemistry dissolved the self, bent time, and exposed the machinery of perception in ways humanity had never seen. This is the journey of a microscopic spark that became a cultural earthquake, a molecule born in darkness, unleashed by curiosity, and destined to change our understanding of reality forever. Before we begin, if you enjoy these types of interesting science topics, hit the like button, comment, and tell us where you are listening from. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, you know what to do. Simply subscribe. In a laboratory in Basel, Switzerland, during the late 1930s, a chemist named Albert Hofmann worked methodically through a series of compounds derived from ergot, a parasitic fungus that had haunted European grain fields for centuries. He was searching for medicines, circulatory stimulants, migraine treatments, compounds that might ease the difficulties of childbirth. The pharmaceutical company Sandoz employed him to investigate the alkaloids hidden within this dark, horn-shaped growth that infected rye. Ergot had a terrible history. In medieval Europe, when rye bread formed the foundation of peasant diets, periodic outbreaks of ergot poisoning swept through entire villages. The affliction earned names like Holy Fire and St. Anthony's Fire. Those who consumed contaminated bread experienced constricted blood vessels in their extremities, leading to gangrene, limbs blackened and fell away. Hallucinations tormented the afflicted. Convulsions seized their bodies. Some historians believe ergot poisoning contributed to accusations of witchcraft, to visions that sparked religious movements, to mass hysterias that rippled across continents. Yet, within this poisonous fungus, scientists discovered valuable chemistry. Ergot alkaloids could stop bleeding, could treat migraines, could induce labor when medically necessary. By the early 20th century, pharmaceutical researchers had learned to cultivate the fungus under controlled conditions and extract its active compounds. They modified these natural substances, adjusting their molecular architecture to enhance desired effects while minimizing toxicity. Hofmann synthesized his 25th compound in this ergot series on a spring day in 1938. The substance showed some interesting properties in initial animal tests, but nothing remarkable enough to warrant further investigation. He filed it away in the laboratory archives, a footnote in a larger research program. 5 years passed. The world descended into global war. Switzerland maintained its neutral position while chaos consumed the continent. In his Basel laboratory, Hofmann continued his work on ergot derivatives. Something about that 25th compound nagged at him, a persistent intuition that it deserved another examination. In the spring of 1943, he synthesized it again. During the final stages of this synthesis, Hofmann began to feel peculiar. A restless sensation crept through his awareness. Colors seemed to intensify. He left the laboratory early, cycling home through Basel's streets, and experienced what he would later describe as an overwhelming flood of visual imagery. Shapes kaleidoscoped behind his closed eyes. Time lost its normal progression. The boundaries between self and world began to dissolve. He had accidentally absorbed a minute quantity of the compound through his skin, an amount so small it would have been nearly invisible to the naked eye. This unintended exposure revealed something extraordinary. Humans possessed a profound sensitivity to this particular molecular structure. A quantity measured in millionths of a gram could radically alter consciousness. 3 days later, Hofmann deliberately ingested what he believed to be a threshold dose. It was far too much. He experienced the first intentional voyage into the territory this molecule would map, a journey that oscillated between wonder and terror, between the dissolution of familiar reality and glimpses of what seemed like fundamental truths about existence. The substance would eventually receive many names. In laboratory documentation, it appeared as a technical designation based on its synthesis number. The German word for acid Cyre became part of its abbreviated form. In English, this compressed into 3 letters that would become among the most culturally loaded in the 20th century, LSD. But in that spring of 1943, it was simply an accident, an unexpected discovery emerging from a research program focused on migraine medication. No one could have predicted that this molecule would catalyze a cultural revolution, would become a tool of psychiatric exploration, would be weaponized by intelligence agencies, would be celebrated as a sacrament and condemned as a destroyer of minds. The journey of this molecule begins not in ancient shamanic traditions or indigenous wisdom, but in the sterile environment of modern pharmaceutical research. It emerges from the scientific method, from the systematic exploration of fungal chemistry, from the chance intersection of human curiosity and molecular possibility. Unlike substances humans had discovered through millennia of plant experimentation, LSD arrived fully formed from the marriage of nature's chemistry and human ingenuity. The ergot fungus, dark and twisted, parasitic and poisonous, contained within its biochemistry the precursors to one of the most powerful consciousness-altering substances ever encountered. Medieval sufferers who lost limbs to ergot poisoning could not have imagined that centuries later, their tormentor would give rise to a compound that would reshape human culture's relationship with consciousness itself. This is where the story begins. In a fungus, in a laboratory, in an accidental exposure, in the recognition that human neurology contained receptors exquisitely sensitive to a particular molecular key. From this origin point, the molecule would travel into human history, carrying with it questions about the nature of mind, the boundaries of acceptable experience, the relationship between chemistry and spirituality, and the power of substances to transform individual consciousness and collective culture. The ergot fungus belongs to the genus Claviceps, organisms that have evolved a sophisticated strategy for survival and reproduction. In early summer, microscopic spores of Claviceps purpurea settle onto the flowers of rye and other grasses. The fungus infiltrates the developing grain, replacing the seed with its own dark, elongated structure, the ergot sclerotium. This hardened mass of fungal tissue serves as the organism's survival capsule through winter. Within this purple-black growth, the fungus produces an arsenal of alkaloid compounds. These chemicals serve as defensive weapons, deterring insects and animals that might otherwise consume the infected grain. The alkaloids are indole derivatives, molecules built around a specific ring structure that occurs throughout nature. This indole core appears in amino acids, in neurotransmitters, in countless plant compounds. It represents one of nature's fundamental chemical motifs, a molecular pattern repeated across biological kingdoms. Pharmaceutical companies learned to cultivate ergot under controlled conditions, bypassing the unpredictability of field infections. In specialized facilities, technicians inoculate rye or wheat with selected fungal strains. The cultivation occurs in large containers where temperature, humidity, and nutrients can be precisely managed. The fungus grows through the grain medium, producing its characteristic alkaloids in concentrated form. After several weeks of growth, workers harvest the culture. The material undergoes extraction processes that separate the alkaloid compounds from cellular debris, starches, and other biological matter. These extracts contain a complex mixture of related substances, each with subtle differences in molecular structure. Some constrict blood vessels, some stimulate smooth muscle, Some cross into the brain and interact with neurotransmitter systems. The pharmaceutical isolation of these alkaloids requires sophisticated chemistry. Technicians must work in controlled environments, managing pH levels, temperatures, and solvent systems to selectively pull desired compounds from the complex biological matrix. The process resembles archaeological excavation, carefully removing layers to reveal specific chemical treasures buried within. Hofmann's work involved modifying these natural alkaloids. The indole core structure could be elaborated, decorated with different chemical groups that altered the molecule's properties. Some modifications enhanced stability. Others changed how the compound interacted with biological tissues. The process required both systematic methodology and creative intuition, trying variations, testing effects, documenting results. The synthesis of LSD required ergot alkaloids as starting materials. Hofmann worked specifically with ergotamine and other related compounds extracted from the fungus. The transformation involved breaking certain bonds, preserving the essential indole architecture, and attaching a diethylamide group to ethyl chains linked through a nitrogen atom. This particular modification, among the many possible variations, created a molecule with unprecedented potency at the brain's serotonin receptors. The chemistry occurs through multiple steps, each transformation building toward the final structure. Protective groups shield certain parts of the molecule, while reactions modify others. Intermediates are isolated, purified, and carried forward. The process requires glassware, heating and cooling systems, careful control of reaction conditions, and most critically, the knowledge to guide these transformations along the desired pathway. What emerges is a crystalline substance, stable at room temperature, sensitive to light and oxygen. In pure form, it appears as colorless crystals or white powder. The compound is extraordinarily potent by weight. Active doses measured in micrograms, millionths of a gram. A quantity that would be barely visible on a fingertip contains dozens of active doses. This potency creates unique challenges and opportunities. A single gram of pure substance could theoretically provide thousands of individual experiences. This concentration means that actual production need not occur on industrial scales. Small laboratories, properly equipped and staffed with knowledgeable chemists, could produce quantities sufficient to supply vast networks. The synthesis requires specific starting materials, most notably the ergot alkaloids themselves. These precursors are controlled substances in most jurisdictions, monitored by pharmaceutical and regulatory authorities. Their movement through legitimate supply chains is documented and restricted. This control point represents a bottleneck in the production pathway, though not an absolute barrier. Compared to plant-based substances that require fields, harvests, and bulk processing, LSD production leaves a minimal physical footprint. No distinctive crops, no telltale odors, no massive quantities of plant material. The entire operation could occur in a space no larger than a typical kitchen, though the knowledge requirements remain substantial. The chemist must understand not only the synthetic pathway but also purification techniques, safety protocols, and the handling of reactive intermediates. Unlike extracting compounds from plants, a process that can proceed with relatively crude technology, creating LSD demands sophisticated chemical education and laboratory skill. This knowledge barrier has historically kept production concentrated in relatively few hands. Unlike substances that can be refined by following simple procedures, LSD synthesis requires someone who understands organic chemistry at a professional level. This has shaped the drug's distribution patterns, creating dependencies on skilled individuals rather than on agricultural operations or bulk processors. From the fungus that terrorized medieval Europe, through the laboratory transformations that unlock and modify its alkaloid chemistry, emerges a molecule that exists almost nowhere in nature. LSD is an artifact of human chemical creativity, a substance that required both natural precursors and scientific knowledge to bring into existence. The journey from ergot to active compound represents a uniquely modern pathway, one that could only occur in the context of 20th century pharmaceutical research. The crystalline substance emerging from synthesis exists in a form too concentrated for practical handling. Pure LSD is measured in quantities that challenge human perception, micrograms rather than milligrams, millionths of a gram rather than thousandths. A standard active dose might weigh between 50 and 200 micrograms, an amount invisible to casual observation. Smaller than a few grains of table salt, this extraordinary potency necessitates dilution. The pure substance must be dispersed into a medium that allows for consistent, manageable dosing. In the early years of pharmaceutical research, when Sandoz distributed LSD to psychiatric researchers and therapists, it came as precisely measured solutions in small vials or as tablets containing known quantities. Each dose was standardized, documented, and supplied through legitimate medical channels. The transformation from research chemical to cultural phenomenon required different distribution methods. When LSD moved beyond clinical settings into underground distribution networks, new delivery systems emerged. The most iconic became blotter paper absorbent sheets printed with colorful designs, perforated into small squares. Each square, typically about a quarter inch on each side, serves as a single dose unit. Creating dosed blotter requires dissolving pure LSD in a solvent, often ethanol or distilled water at carefully calculated concentrations. The sheet of absorbent paper is then saturated with this solution, either by immersion or careful application. As the solvent evaporates, the LSD molecules remain fixed within the paper fibers, distributed across the sheet. If the concentration and application are uniform, each perforated square contains approximately the same amount. This method elegantly solves several problems. Blotter paper is lightweight, easily concealed, and can be decorated with artwork that serves both aesthetic and branding purposes. The paper protects the substance from light degradation to some degree, though LSD remains sensitive to heat, light, and moisture over time. Proper storage requires cool, dark, dry conditions. Other delivery forms have included gelatin squares, small, translucent pieces sometimes called window pane, and liquid preparations where drops are placed on sugar cubes, candy, or directly onto the tongue. Each method represents an attempt to bridge the gap between molecular scale potency and human scale handling. The purity and consistency of dosing varies enormously across sources. Unlike pharmaceutical production with its rigorous quality control, underground manufacturing occurs without standardization. One batch might contain substantially more or less than advertised. Variation in synthesis skill, precursor purity, and preparation technique all affect the final product. Some samples contain no LSD at all, instead substituting other substances that produce vaguely similar effects. Research chemicals from the tryptamine or phenethylamine families occasionally appear on blotter paper, sold as LSD but possessing different safety profiles and effects. This substitution creates unpredictability and risk, as users expect one substance but receive another. The environmental impact of LSD production differs markedly from plant-based drug manufacturing. No fields are burned to clear land for cultivation. No fertilizers run off into waterways. No bulk plant material requires processing with volatile solvents in jungle laboratories. The footprint remains small, concentrated in the laboratory space itself. However, the precursors and reagents used in synthesis do carry environmental implications. Ergot alkaloid extraction generates biological waste. The synthesis itself requires organic solvents, acids, bases, and reactive compounds that must be disposed of properly. In legitimate pharmaceutical settings, These waste streams are managed according to environmental regulations. In clandestine operations, disposal practices vary widely. The global precursor market for LSD centers on ergot alkaloids and related compounds. Pharmaceutical companies that manufacture migraine medications and other ergot-derived drugs maintain supplies of these starting materials. Regulatory agencies monitor sales and distribution, requiring documentation and licensing. This creates a choke point that limits production capacity, though determined chemists have occasionally found creative workarounds. Some have attempted total synthesis, building the entire molecular structure from simpler, unregulated compounds rather than modifying ergot alkaloids. This approach is chemically possible but significantly more complex, requiring additional steps and expertise. It has never become the dominant production method. The concentration of LSD from crystalline substance to distributed doses represents a critical transformation. This is where the molecule becomes accessible to human experience, where abstract chemistry becomes potential consciousness change. The process requires care, knowledge, and attention to detail. Errors in dilution or distribution can result in doses far exceeding intended levels, turning manageable experiences into overwhelming ordeals. Throughout this transformation phase, the substance moves further from its pharmaceutical origins. What began as a research chemical with defined purity and dosing becomes an underground commodity with variable quality, uncertain provenance, and inconsistent strength. This transition carries profound implications for safety, predictability, and the nature of experiences people encounter. Yet the basic chemistry remains unchanged. The molecule that Hofmann accidentally absorbed through his skin in 1943 is the same molecule distributed on decorated blotter paper decades later. Its structure, its potency, its interaction with human neurology, these remain constant even as the contexts of use transform completely. The journey of LSD through human society traces an unusual path among psychoactive substances. Unlike cocaine's movement from Andean cultivation through refining operations to global markets, or heroin's route from poppy fields through conversion laboratories to street distribution, LSD's trajectory has been shaped by its synthetic origins and extraordinary potency. In the 1950s, LSD traveled exclusively through legitimate channels. Sandoz Pharmaceuticals distributed it under the trade name Delicid to psychiatrists, psychologists, and researchers investigating its therapeutic potential. Therapists used it to facilitate psychoanalysis, theorizing that the dissolution of ego defenses might allow patients to access repressed material. Others explored its capacity to model psychotic states, hoping to understand schizophrenia by temporarily inducing similar experiences in healthy volunteers. During this period, the substance moved openly through medical supply networks. Clinicians ordered it through standard pharmaceutical channels. Research papers documented results. Academic conferences featured presentations on LSD-assisted therapy. The molecule existed firmly within the realm of medicine and science. Simultaneously, intelligence agencies took interest. The American Central Intelligence Agency initiated research programs exploring LSD as a potential tool for interrogation, mind control, and psychological warfare. Projects with code names like MKULTRA investigated whether the drug could break down resistance, extract information, or create malleable subjects. These programs involved dosing unwitting subjects, monitoring effects, and pursuing what now seems like science fiction scenarios. The cultural explosion occurred in the early 1960s. A Harvard psychology professor named Timothy Leary, along with his colleague Richard Alpert, began research into psilocybin and LSD. Their work increasingly blurred boundaries between scientific investigation and personal philosophy. Leary's advocacy moved from academic exploration to countercultural evangelism, His encouragement to turn on, tune in, drop out became a rallying cry for a generation seeking alternatives to conventional consciousness. LSD flowed into the burgeoning counterculture through multiple channels. Some supplies came from remaining pharmaceutical stocks. Others emerged from chemists who possessed the knowledge and materials to synthesize new batches. The Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco became an epicenter, with widespread use contributing to the music, art, and ethos of the era. The substance's capacity to produce profound experiences with minimal material requirements made it ideal for distributed production. Unlike operations requiring agricultural infrastructure, a single skilled chemist with access to precursors could supply thousands of users. Several legendary figures emerged during this period, individuals who produced enormous quantities and distributed them through networks of like-minded associates. One such chemist, working from various locations across the American West, manufactured LSD on a scale that supplied a significant portion of the entire market for years. His operation demonstrated both the concentrated nature of production and the relative ease of distribution. The substance moved through social networks, from trusted associates to communities of users, often more through ideological affinity than traditional profit motive. International distribution expanded as the counterculture became global. LSD traveled to Europe, Australia, and beyond, carried in tiny quantities that could easily evade detection. A few sheets of blotter paper represented thousands of doses and negligible weight. Unlike bulk plant materials that require elaborate smuggling operations, LSD could move through regular mail systems, in luggage, in countless unremarkable ways. Governments responded with prohibition. The United States classified LSD as a Schedule I substance in the late 1960s, declaring it to have no accepted medical use and high potential for abuse. Other nations followed similar paths. Sandoz stopped producing and distributing it. Research programs shuttered. The molecule's legal status transformed from medicine to contraband. This prohibition paradoxically ensured that production would shift entirely underground. With no legitimate medical supply, all LSD came from clandestine laboratories. The knowledge required for synthesis became precious and closely held. Apprenticeship relationships formed as experienced chemists trained successors. Online forums and encrypted communications later facilitated knowledge sharing among producers. Production has historically concentrated in certain geographic locations. Northern California maintained a reputation as a center of manufacture, though operations occurred worldwide. European networks developed their own supply chains. The emergence of dark web markets in the early 21st century revolutionized distribution, creating online marketplaces where buyers and sellers connected pseudonymously, with packages shipped through postal systems. These digital markets demonstrated LSD's unique suitability for mail-order distribution. Unlike bulk drugs that risk detection through odor or appearance, blotter paper looks unremarkable. Concealed within greeting cards, magazines, or standard envelopes, it passes through sorting facilities undetected. The risk-to-reward ratio makes it attractive for both vendors and consumers. The global trade network remains diffuse rather than hierarchical. Unlike cocaine or heroin cartels controlling territory and supply chains through violence, LSD distribution tends toward loose networks of independent operators. The small scale of production, the knowledge barriers to entry, and the relatively peaceful culture surrounding the substance have prevented the emergence of large criminal organizations focused specifically on it. Nevertheless, law enforcement has devoted substantial resources to identifying and prosecuting manufacturers. The Drug Enforcement Administration maintains specialized units investigating clandestine laboratories. Successful prosecutions often result in decades-long prison sentences, reflecting the enormous quantities represented by even modest amounts of pure substance. Modern production continues with new generations of chemists learning the craft. Precursor monitoring has tightened, making ergot alkaloid acquisition more challenging. Some producers have turned to total synthesis or cultivated relationships with individuals in positions to divert pharmaceutical supplies. Others work in jurisdictions with less stringent regulatory oversight. The molecule's journey through global networks reflects its unique characteristics. Profound potency, requiring minimal material, synthesis demanding specialized knowledge, and cultural associations with consciousness exploration rather than escapism. From Swiss laboratories through clinical research to countercultural explosion to underground networks to digital marketplaces, LSD has traveled paths distinct from virtually any other psychoactive substance in human history. When LSD reaches the end user, it most commonly appears as blotter paper, small perforated squares decorated with colorful artwork. The designs range from simple geometric patterns to intricate illustrations, from cartoon characters to spiritual symbols to abstract art. These images serve multiple functions: aesthetic appeal, brand identification, and sometimes dosing indicators, as different prints might correspond to particular batches or strengths. A typical dose unit measures roughly 6 millimeters square, small enough to rest on a fingernail. Users place the paper on or under the tongue, where saliva gradually dissolves the cellulose fibers and releases the molecule. Absorption begins through the mouth's mucous membranes and continues in the digestive tract. Effects typically commence within 30 to 90 minutes, depending on stomach contents and individual metabolism. Less common forms include liquid preparations, where LSD is dissolved in alcohol or distilled water and administered by drops. Users place drops onto candy, sugar cubes, or directly under the tongue. Dosing precision improves with experience but remains inherently approximate in informal settings. Some tablets or gel caps contain LSD, though these are rarer than blotter. The visual appearance reveals little about actual content. Laboratory testing is the only reliable method to confirm identity and measure concentration. Testing services exist, often associated with harm reduction organizations at music festivals or through mail-in laboratory analysis. These services reveal that what is sold as LSD sometimes contains other substances entirely. Research chemicals from the tryptamine family occasionally substitute for LSD. Compounds with names like 25-INBOMe or other synthetic tryptamines produce somewhat similar effects but with different safety profiles. Some of these substitutes carry greater risks of physical harm at high doses. Users expecting the established safety profile of LSD may unknowingly consume substances with more dangerous characteristics. True LSD blotter has certain characteristics. It is tasteless, or nearly so, with perhaps faint bitterness from ink or paper. A distinctly bitter or numbing sensation often indicates the presence of substitute substances. The onset with authentic LSD is gradual, building over the first hour. Some substitutes produce faster-acting effects. Street pricing reflects the minuscule quantities involved. Single-dose units typically cost between $5 and $15, though prices vary by region, supply networks, and bulk quantities. The cost per microgram is extraordinarily high, but the absolute price per experience remains moderate. A sheet of 100 doses wholesale might cost a few $100s, while retail sales could generate several thousand. Purity variation significantly impacts experiences. A dose advertised as containing 100 micrograms might contain anywhere from 50 to 200 or more. Without laboratory analysis, users rely on dosing conservatively and adjusting based on effects. Experienced users develop intuitions about appropriate amounts, but can still encounter unexpectedly strong batches. Cultural contexts of use have evolved across decades. The The 1960s counterculture embraced LSD as a tool for spiritual awakening, political consciousness, and creative exploration. Users gathered at concerts, in parks, in communal living situations. The substance became associated with rock music, psychedelic art, and philosophical questioning of social norms. Subsequent decades saw shifting patterns. The 1970s underground persisted with less public visibility. The 1980s and 90s brought rave culture, where LSD joined ecstasy and other substances in nightclub and festival settings. The emphasis shifted from introspection towards sensory enhancement and social bonding. The 21st century introduced microdosing, consuming subperceptual amounts intended to enhance creativity, focus, and mood without producing obvious intoxication. Silicon Valley professionals, artists, and others adopted protocols involving doses of 5 to 20 micrograms, typically taken every few days. This practice remains controversial, with limited, rigorous research supporting claimed benefits. Geographic and socioeconomic patterns show LSD use concentrated among educated populations, middle and upper middle class users, and cultural contexts emphasizing consciousness exploration. Unlike substances associated with poverty and desperation, LSD tends to appear in relatively privileged settings. This pattern reflects both cost, cultural associations, and the demanding nature of the experience itself. Music festivals and outdoor gatherings remain common settings for use. The extended duration of effects, 8 to 12 hours from a full dose, requires substantial time commitment and appropriate environment. Users typically plan experiences around free days, trusted companions, and comfortable spaces. Integration of experiences poses challenges. The profound perceptual and cognitive alterations during the experience can feel immensely meaningful in the moment but prove difficult to translate into lasting change. Some users report genuine insights about themselves and their lives. Others find the experience fascinating but disconnected from daily reality. Public health perspectives on LSD have shifted somewhat as research has resumed. The substance shows remarkably low toxicity, with no documented deaths from overdose in typical use situations. The primary risks are psychological, overwhelming experiences, triggering anxiety or panic, or, in rare cases, precipitating longer-term mental health issues in vulnerable individuals. The setting in which LSD is consumed profoundly influences outcomes. The concept of set and setting, psychological state and physical environment emerges consistently in both clinical research and user accounts. Comfortable, safe environments with trusted companions generally produce more positive experiences than chaotic, unpredictable settings with strangers. From blotter paper in a small plastic bag to the profound alteration of consciousness it produces, LSD represents a peculiar relationship between material and effect. The substance itself is almost nothing, a few hundred micrograms of crystalline compound on a scrap of paper. Yet this negligible physical presence catalyzes hours of transformed perception, demonstrating the extraordinary sensitivity of human neurology to particular molecular structures. The human brain operates through networks of neurons communicating via chemical messengers called neurotransmitters. One of these messengers, serotonin, plays crucial roles in regulating mood, perception, cognition, and countless physiological functions. Neurons that send and receive serotonin signals are distributed throughout the brain, with particularly dense concentrations in regions involved in sensory processing, emotion, and higher cognition. Serotonin exerts its effects by binding to receptor proteins embedded in neuron membranes. These receptors come in multiple subtypes, each with distinct functions and locations. One particular subtype, the 2A receptor, becomes the key to understanding LSD's effects. When serotonin molecules bind to these receptors, They trigger cascades of cellular responses. The receptor changes shape, initiating signaling pathways that ultimately influence whether neurons fire or remain silent. LSD's molecular structure resembles serotonin closely enough to fit into these same receptors. The indole core structure, present in both molecules, acts as a recognition motif. But LSD binds with extraordinary affinity, holding on to receptors tenaciously and activating them with unusual strength and duration. Where serotonin might bind briefly and release, LSD remains attached, continuously stimulating the receptor for extended periods. This prolonged activation occurs throughout brain networks simultaneously. Regions that normally filter and organize sensory information become hyperactive. The visual cortex, receiving boosted signals, generates patterns and distortions even with eyes closed. The thalamus, which acts as a gatekeeper for sensory information entering consciousness, allows through signals normally suppressed as irrelevant. The result is a flood of sensory data that would typically remain beneath conscious awareness. Users notice textures, colors, and patterns with unusual intensity. Objects seem to breathe or ripple. Boundaries between discrete items blur and merge. The brain's predictive models of reality, the stable, consistent world we normally perceive, begin to fragment. Beyond sensory distortion, LSD affects networks involved in self-awareness and identity. The default mode network, a collection of brain regions active during rest and self-reflection, shows dramatically reduced activity and connectivity under LSD's influence. This network maintains our sense of being a distinct self with a continuous narrative. Its disruption produces what users describe as ego dissolution, a temporary loss of the boundary between self and environment. This dissolution can feel liberating or terrifying. Some experience it as unity with the universe, a transcendent merging with all existence. Others experience disorienting loss of identity, uncertainty about what they are, or where self ends and world begins. The interpretation depends heavily on psychological preparation, environment, and personal history. Time perception warps significantly. The brain's internal clock seems to malfunction. Minutes stretch into apparent hours. Sequences of events become difficult to order. Past, present, and future feel simultaneously accessible. This temporal distortion likely reflects disrupted communication between brain regions that normally coordinate to create our linear sense of time's flow. Synesthesia commonly occurs, the crossing of sensory modalities. Users might see sounds as colors, hear visual patterns, or experience tactile sensations in response to music. This phenomenon results from increased communication between normally segregated sensory processing regions. Neural signals bleed across boundaries, creating novel associations. Emotionally, LSD produces a state of heightened suggestibility and emotional ability. Users might cycle rapidly between euphoria and anxiety, profound insight and confusion, connection and isolation. The emotional centers of the brain become more responsive to both internal states and external cues. This volatility explains why set and setting so powerfully determine experiences. The body experiences notable physical effects, though these are generally mild compared to the psychological impact. Pupils dilate widely, often remaining expanded for the duration of effects. This mydriasis results from LSD's action on autonomic nervous system receptors. Heart rate typically increases moderately. Blood pressure may rise slightly. Body temperature can fluctuate, with users feeling alternately hot and cold. Fine motor control becomes slightly impaired. Coordination remains generally intact, but subtle movements feel awkward. Some users experience mild nausea, particularly during the onset phase. This often passes as effects intensify. Appetite typically disappears for the duration. returning only as effects fade. Sleep becomes impossible during the experience, and for several hours afterward, the brain remains activated, consciousness alert, despite physical fatigue. This stimulation results from the persistent binding to serotonin receptors throughout systems governing arousal and wakefulness. The effects reach peak intensity between 2 and 4 hours after ingestion, then gradually decline over the following hours. Total duration typically ranges from 8 to 12 hours, though some residual perceptual alterations can persist longer. The extended timeline results from LSD's strong receptor binding. It takes hours for the molecule to fully release and be metabolized. The brain processes and eliminates LSD primarily through liver enzymes. Metabolites are eventually excreted through urine. The substance does not accumulate in the body with repeated use. Each exposure follows a similar pharmacological trajectory, regardless of previous experiences. Tolerance develops rapidly with repeated use. If someone takes LSD multiple days consecutively, subsequent doses produce diminished effects. The serotonin receptors become temporarily less responsive, a phenomenon called downregulation. Full sensitivity returns after several days without use. This tolerance pattern discourages daily use, unlike some substances that can be consumed repeatedly without diminished effects. The mechanism underlying LSD's effects demonstrates the brain's extraordinary sensitivity to specific molecular structures. A quantity of substance weighing less than a few grains of salt profoundly reorganizes perception, cognition, and consciousness for hours. This reveals how precisely tuned our neural chemistry must be, operating within narrow parameters. When those parameters shift when receptors receive powerful, sustained stimulation from an external molecule, the entire architecture of subjective experience transforms. Understanding these mechanisms demystifies without diminishing. The visionary experiences, the sense of profound meaning, the apparent insights all emerge from altered patterns of neural firing, from regions communicating in unusual ways, from the temporary disruption of systems that normally create our stable sense of self and reality. The experiences are no less real to the person undergoing them, but they result from specific, describable changes in brain chemistry rather than from accessing alternate dimensions or supernatural truths. LSD occupies an unusual position in the landscape of drug-related harm. Unlike many substances that produce dose-dependent physical toxicity, LSD shows remarkably low potential for direct bodily damage. No documented deaths from overdose exist in typical use situations. The molecule does not damage organs, does not accumulate in tissues, does not produce the chronic physical deterioration associated with stimulants, opioids, or alcohol. This absence of direct toxicity has been confirmed through decades of research and millions of individual exposures. While emergency room visits occasionally occur due to psychological distress during experiences, medical intervention rarely requires more than calm environment and reassurance. The physical dangers of LSD are minimal compared to its psychological risks. Addiction does not develop through the mechanisms typical of habit-forming substances. LSD produces no physical withdrawal syndrome. Users do not develop compulsive patterns of use despite negative consequences. The rapid tolerance development actually discourages frequent use. Taking the substance on consecutive days yields diminishing effects, requiring increasingly higher doses for similar experiences. Some individuals do develop patterns of very frequent use, but these patterns typically reflect psychological seeking rather than physical dependence. The demanding nature of the experience, 8 to 12 hours of altered consciousness, provides a natural barrier to casual overuse. Most users space experiences weeks or months apart, allowing time for integration and return to baseline. The primary risks are psychological. For individuals with latent or active psychotic disorders, LSD can trigger or exacerbate symptoms. Schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and other conditions involving disrupted reality testing may worsen following use. While LSD does not cause these conditions in people without underlying vulnerability, it can accelerate onset in those predisposed. Determining who carries this vulnerability remains challenging. Family history of psychotic disorders represents a clear risk factor. Early signs of unusual thought patterns or perceptual experiences suggest caution. However, some individuals with no apparent risk factors experience persistent difficulties following LSD use. Hallucinogen persisting perception disorder represents a rare but documented phenomenon. Some users experience ongoing visual distortions, trails following moving objects, geometric patterns in the peripheral vision, intensified colors, or other perceptual anomalies long after the drug has been eliminated from the body. These symptoms can persist for months or years, causing distress and functional impairment. The mechanism underlying this disorder remains unclear. Theories suggest persistent changes in visual processing systems, alterations in how the brain filters sensory information, or anxiety-driven attention to perceptual experiences that would normally be ignored. Treatment approaches include medications used for anxiety, reassurance, and acceptance strategies, and time symptoms often gradually diminish. Challenging psychological experiences represent another risk category. While not causing lasting harm in most cases, intensely frightening or overwhelming experiences during the altered state can leave emotional residue. Users who experience terror, paranoia, or profound existential distress may develop anxiety about future episodes or struggle to integrate difficult experiences. The concept of a bad trip encompasses a range of difficult psychological states: overwhelming anxiety, paranoid thoughts, terrifying hallucinations, sense of dying or going insane, or confrontation with disturbing psychological material. These experiences occur more frequently in inappropriate settings, with high doses, in unstable psychological states, or when users resist the experience rather than accepting it. Some users report lasting positive changes following LSD experiences. Research from the 1950s and 60s, along with contemporary studies, suggests that carefully structured experiences can produce improvements in mood, reductions in anxiety, increases in openness, and shifts in values or perspectives. These positive outcomes appear more likely in therapeutic contexts with preparation and integration support. The contrast between therapeutic and recreational contexts reveals important patterns. When users approach the experience with intention, in safe environments, with trusted guides or therapists, and with subsequent processing of the experience, positive outcomes become more probable. Random, impulsive use in chaotic settings with strangers increases risk of difficulties. Comparing LSD to other psychedelics reveals both similarities and distinctions. Psilocybin, the active component in certain mushrooms, produces effects similar to LSD but with shorter duration and somewhat different subjective quality. Users often describe psilocybin as warmer, more organic, while LSD feels more electric and analytical. Both substances act primarily through serotonin receptors and share similar safety profiles. DMT, another tryptamine, produces extremely intense but brief experiences. Mescaline from peyote or San Pedro cacti offers longer experiences with distinct phenomenological characteristics. Ayahuasca combines DMT with enzyme inhibitors, creating experiences that include significant physical effects alongside psychological ones. Each psychedelic has unique attributes but shares the fundamental mechanism of serotonin receptor activation. LSD differs from substances like MDMA, which combines stimulant effects with emotional openness, or dissociatives like ketamine, which produce detachment from body and environment through different receptor systems. The category of psychedelics or hallucinogens includes diverse substances with varying mechanisms and effects. Neuroplasticity research suggests that psychedelics, including LSD, may promote the growth of new neural connections, at least temporarily. Studies show increased dendritic branching and synapse formation following psychedelic exposure. Whether these changes contribute to therapeutic effects remains under investigation. The brain's enhanced plasticity during altered states might allow for learning, perspective shifts, or emotional processing difficult in ordinary consciousness. Long-term users, individuals with dozens or hundreds of experiences over years or decades, show mixed outcomes. Some report continued benefit from occasional use, maintaining practices of periodic experiences for insight or creativity. Others eventually cease use, finding diminishing returns or loss of interest. No evidence suggests cumulative physical damage from repeated use, though psychological impacts vary individually. The absence of major physical harm combined with potential psychological risks creates a nuanced harm profile. LSD is not benign. It can trigger serious psychological difficulties in vulnerable individuals, but it lacks the chronic toxicity, addiction potential, and physical deterioration associated with many substances. This profile has influenced changing regulatory perspectives, with some jurisdictions reconsidering classification and others supporting renewed therapeutic research. Medical research has resumed after decades of prohibition-induced dormancy. Contemporary studies investigate LSD-assisted therapy for anxiety, depression, addiction, and end-of-life distress. Early results suggest promise, though the research remains preliminary. These investigations represent a return to questions abandoned in the late 1960s when political pressures ended psychiatric exploration. The long-term impact of LSD on individuals and society cannot be reduced to simple harm or benefit calculations. For some, experiences prove transformative in positive directions. For others, they bring difficult challenges. For most, they represent intense but ultimately integrated experiences that become part of life history without dramatic, ongoing consequences. The molecule's journey through human neurology leaves variable traces, depending on biology, psychology, context, and chance. The journey of LSD from ergot alkaloid to cultural force encompasses far more than chemistry and neurology. This molecule became entangled with profound questions about consciousness, spirituality, creativity, freedom, and the relationship between individual experience and social control. Its story intersects with psychiatry, Cold War paranoia, youth rebellion, music and art movements, indigenous rights, and evolving understanding of the human mind. In the 1950s, psychiatrists believed they had discovered a powerful therapeutic tool. LSD seemed to offer a shortcut through years of psychoanalysis, allowing patients to access unconscious material and achieve breakthroughs in single sessions. Therapists documented remarkable results with alcoholics, with terminally ill patients facing existential distress, with individuals suffering from depression and anxiety unresponsive to conventional treatments. Thousands of research papers emerged from this period. Studies explored optimal dosing, set and setting variables, integration techniques, and potential mechanisms of therapeutic action. The research suggested that LSD did not work through simple pharmacological effects, but through the experiences it catalyzed profound psychological encounters that could shift perspectives, dissolve rigid patterns, and open space for change. This psychiatric research occurred simultaneously with Cold War intelligence programs investigating LSD as a potential weapon. The contrast could not be more stark. Therapists seeking healing, while intelligence operatives pursued mind control. Both recognized the substance's power to disrupt ordinary consciousness, but their intentions diverged completely. The intelligence programs remain controversial and partially documented. Unwitting subjects were dosed and observed. Experiments crossed ethical boundaries that would be unthinkable in contemporary research. The programs yielded little actionable intelligence capability, but left damaged lives and enduring distrust. When these programs became public knowledge decades later, they contributed to cynicism about government authority and scientific institutions. The counterculture's embrace of LSD transformed the substance from research tool to cultural symbol. Young people experimenting with consciousness saw themselves as pioneers exploring inner space, challenging a materialistic society that valued conformity over individual experience. LSD became associated with pacifism, environmental awareness, communal living, and questioning of authority. Music evolved under the influence of altered perception. Rock bands created soundscapes meant to complement psychedelic experiences. Album artwork exploded with vivid colors and surreal imagery. Lyrics explored themes of cosmic consciousness and spiritual seeking. An entire aesthetic emerged, shaped by the perceptual transformations the substance produced. Visual art underwent similar transformation. Artists working under the influence or inspired by psychedelic experiences created intricate, luminous works featuring organic forms, geometric patterns, and impossible spaces. The psychedelic art movement influenced design, illustration, and fine art, leaving lasting marks on visual culture. Some attribute technological innovation partially to LSD's influence in Silicon Valley. Computer pioneers experimented with the substance, sometimes claiming it enhanced creative problem-solving or helped envision new possibilities for technology. Whether LSD directly contributed to innovation remains debatable, but certainly a culture of consciousness exploration intersected with technological development in particular times and places. The backlash was inevitable. Parents feared their children were damaging their brains. Authority figures saw social order threatened. Politicians seized on drug use as a campaign issue. The association between LSD and anti-war protests intensified official concern. Media coverage emphasized rare negative outcomes, creating public perception of severe danger. Prohibition transformed the landscape completely. Research collapsed as funding disappeared and regulatory barriers made studies impossible. Therapeutic use ended. The molecule became available only through illegal channels, eliminating quality control and medical supervision. Knowledge about optimal use conditions became fragmented, passed through underground networks rather than scientific literature. Indigenous peoples who had used natural psychedelics for millennia watched as their traditional practices became criminalized. Peyote, ayahuasca, and mushrooms faced similar prohibition. The irony was profound. Traditions predating European contact by centuries became illegal, while the societies imposing these laws had no historical relationship with these substances. The environmental impact of LSD itself remained minimal, but prohibition's broader effects were substantial. Enforcement consumed resources. Incarceration destroyed lives. The war on drugs, using LSD and other substances as justification, created cascading consequences throughout societies, particularly impacting marginalized communities. Families experienced both benefits and harms. Some individuals credit LSD experiences with helping them overcome addiction, depression, or limited perspectives, improving their relationships and capacity for connection. Others have seen family members experience psychological crises or persist in patterns of substance use that damaged familial bonds. Economic impacts remain modest compared to substances with larger user bases. LSD markets generate revenue but represent a tiny fraction of illegal drug economies. The concentrated nature of production and distribution prevents the massive infrastructure and associated violence characteristic of cocaine or heroin trades. Ecosystems have been spared the devastation associated with drug production in many regions. No forests burned for LSD cultivation. No rivers contaminated by bulk processing. The footprint remains contained within laboratories and chemical supply chains. This represents one of the few unambiguously positive aspects of a synthetic rather than plant-based substance. Cultural impacts extend into philosophy and spirituality. The experiences catalyzed by LSD raised questions about the nature of consciousness that philosophers and contemplatives have pursued for millennia. Does consciousness depend entirely on brain chemistry, or do these substances reveal something beyond the material? Users encounter experiences that feel spiritual, transcendent, meaningful, yet result from specific molecular interactions. This paradox continues to generate reflection. The modern renaissance in psychedelic research represents a form of cultural redemption. Universities and medical institutions have resumed studies abandoned 50 years prior. Clinical trials investigate LSD and related substances for treatment-resistant depression, anxiety disorders, PTSD, and addiction. Early results suggest therapeutic potential, validating the early psychiatric intuitions. These contemporary studies proceed with ethical safeguards absent in earlier eras. Informed consent is rigorous. Therapeutic protocols are carefully structured. Integration support helps participants process experiences. The research aims not to promote recreational use but to explore legitimate medical applications under controlled conditions. Harm reduction approaches have evolved, acknowledging that prohibition has not eliminated use and that education serves users better than punishment. Organizations provide drug testing, information about safe practices, psychological support, and medical resources. This pragmatic approach prioritizes health over enforcement. The story of LSD illuminates broader themes about human consciousness, social control, and the tension between individual experience and collective norms. Societies have always grappled with mind-altering substances, seeking to manage their use while respecting personal autonomy. LSD's extreme potency and profound effects intensified these tensions. From a fungus that caused medieval suffering to a pharmaceutical discovery to a cultural lightning rod to a renewed research subject, the molecule has traveled a path shaped by human choices, social forces, and historical contingencies. The same substance has been medicine, sacrament, weapon, recreation, and scientific tool. Its meaning shifts with context, while its chemistry remains constant. The journey comes full circle. Research beginning in Basel laboratories in the 1930s, interrupted by prohibition in the 1960s, has resumed in the 21st century. The questions psychiatrists posed 80 years ago are being asked again with modern neuroscience techniques. Can these experiences heal? How do they transform perception and thought? What can they teach about consciousness? Indigenous peoples who maintained relationships with natural psychedelics despite prohibition are gaining recognition and legal protections for traditional practices. Their knowledge, preserved through generations, enriches contemporary understanding of how to approach these substances with respect and intention. The molecule itself remains unchanged, a particular arrangement of atoms that binds to serotonin receptors with unusual affinity. But the human understanding of it continues evolving. Each generation rediscovers, reinterprets, and reintegrates this substance into their social context. LSD's story is ultimately a human story. It reveals how scientific discoveries can transform cultures, how societies respond to challenges to consensus reality, how individuals seek meaning through altered states, and how knowledge becomes fragmented by prohibition then gradually reconstructed. The journey from ergot to consciousness to culture continues, shaped by ongoing scientific research, shifting social attitudes, and individuals encountering profound experiences that resist simple categorization. In this molecule's path through human civilization, we see reflections of our deepest questions. What is consciousness? What defines normal perception? Who decides which experiences are legitimate? How do we balance individual autonomy with collective well-being? The answers remain contested, evolving, incomplete. But the questions themselves, illuminated by this molecule's journey, continue to challenge and inspire.